So understanding our hormones. Okay, let's talk about what hormones are and then stress versus sex hormones. All right. So hormones are these chemical messengers produced by our glands in the endocrine system, our hypothalamus, pituitary, pineal glands, etc. They travel through the bloodstream, they target cells, they target organs, and they tell things to turn on or off, right? They influence our bodily functions like tissue growth, our heart rate, our mood. Hormones bring the body back into balance, equilibrium. Stress hormones rev us up so we can leap into action. Sex hormones help calm us down to create tissues and to potentially create new life, right? Egg and sperm. And then to sustain it in the womb, our uterine lining, the placenta, and postpartum breast milk, right? So stress hormones rev us up, sex hormones calm us down. We need the duality, just like we need all the doshas, right, to stay balanced. We eat food to create kapha and tissue, but we need pitta to metabolize, transform it into tissue, into energy, into waste material. And then we need vata to move it through our system and distribute it around the body as needed. So one of the main hormones, right, in a woman's body is estrogen. It's really juicy. Estrogen develops and maintains our female sexual characteristics like our breasts. And it stimulates the growth of the uterine lining. It influences our bone health, our cardiovascular health, and our brain function. Estrogen is kapha or ojas in hormone form. Okay. So think estrogen, you're thinking kapha, ojas, water and earth, stability and moisture. Every single tissue in our body has been found to contain estrogen. Every single cell needs a lubrication, needs nourishment. Every cell needs kapha. Every cell needs ojas, right? That resiliency. And there are three main kinds of estrogen: estradiol, estrone, and estriol. We're really just going to talk about estradiol and estrone. And this is a big message I want to convey in this talk. We don't stop producing estrogen after menopause. We don't. So we have enough to get us through until death if we respect ourselves and stay in balance. Okay, we really take care of ourselves. Talk about all the things that we can do. So estradiol is produced on our ovaries and our adrenal glands. So keep that in mind, okay? It's produced in the ovaries and the adrenal glands. The adrenal glands are those little endocrine organs that sit on top of your kidneys, okay? And they produce adrenaline, adrenal glands, adrenaline, but they also, so stress hormones, but they can also produce sex hormones. And estradiol is the most potent form of the different forms of estrogen. Okay, and so this is usually what you're seeing on your on your birth control label or your hormone replacement therapy label, right? Estradiol. After menopause, the ovaries stop producing estrogen. Okay, you may know that. And the adrenal glands, you may not know this, the adrenal glands take over. They can take over. Okay. Store that away in the back of your brain for a few more minutes. Estrone is produced by the placenta during pregnancy and by, important, fat tissue, also muscle tissue. So this is the major source of estrogen for us after menopause because the liver can transform it into estradiol and vice versa. Okay, so your fat tissue, your adrenal glands, and your liver, really important little organs. The liver is a big organ, but really important to take care of these organs. We'll talk about how. So estrogen of one kind or another is naturally created by the body, either in the ovaries, the adrenal glands, or from some other precursor hormones that can be turned into estrogen. You can create estrogen out of a lot of things, interestingly enough. So progesterone, testosterone, and other hormones can be turned into estrogen. Isn't that fascinating? Who knew? Progesterone, testosterone, and other precursor hormones are created in the ovaries, the adrenal glands, and through the entire body and our fat cells, our bone, our muscle, our skin, our brain, and all kinds of other tissues. So precursor hormones, body tissues, and even the ovaries, because they produce precursor hormones, can produce estrogen after menopause. So the ovaries, again, they produce precursor hormones called androgens. And those are converted into estrogen in the fat tissues and the liver, right? We talked about that ability to create estradiol from estrone, right? In the fat and in the liver. And post-menopausal women with a lot of fat tissue could actually have more estrogen post-menopause than a woman, let's say in her 20s or 30s, who doesn't have enough fat tissue. Isn't that interesting? So fat tissue can determine how much estrogen you have really throughout your life, not just postmenopause. So it's good to have a little fat, good to have a little fat on our frames. So to produce estrogen, we also need two other things, aromatase and estrogen receptors. You don't have to remember any of this. I just think I want you to know how amazing your body is and what it's capable of doing. And what actually happens, right? There are these mechanisms in place after our ovaries stop producing estrogen to keep it going, to keep it going. So aromatase can instantly transform precursor hormones like testosterone into estrogen. And aromatase is found mostly in our fat and our muscle tissues. So again, we need some fat, we need some muscle on our bodies in menopause to make all this stuff work. But also our bones, our blood vessels, our brain tissue, and our breasts. Right? So lots of places where we find aromatase. Okay, aromatase, it declines after menopause. However, good news, it gets more potent. It gets more effective at doing its job, which I just think is fascinating. Our bodies are so intelligent. Nature's looking out for us, right? Estrogen receptors, we need those too. Those are all over the body, right? They're in every tissue. They're the proteins inside your cells that bind to the estrogen and affect processes, right? Kind of turn it on or off, put it to work. We have an abundance of both all over the body. So good news, right? You're set. Even after menopause, you're equipped to produce estrogen. Okay, what happens if we have too much estrogen? Things like weight gain, lethargy, right? That kind of dull, unmotivated feeling, depression, lowered libido, fibrocystic or tender breasts, water retention, uterine fibroids, an increased chance of breast or endometrial cancer. Ayurveda would say these are all kapha symptoms. Remember, estrogen is kapha is ojas. So these are all kapha symptoms in Ayurveda. And we have ways we can balance them through diet, through lifestyle, all the things. Okay. So you don't necessarily need to turn to HRT unless you want to. Okay. It's not like this, that's not your only option. Ayurveda has been dealing with these symptoms for thousands of years. Okay. What if you don't have enough estrogen? Then things get dry. Vaginal dryness, dry skin, hot flashes, night sweats, bone loss, increased risk of cardiovascular disease. Your tissues become depleted. These are all vata pitta type symptoms. We would say vata pushing pitta, right? So air fanning the flames of the fire into a conflagration and then blowing it out, right? Like your night sweats or bone loss, right? So burning tissue up or drying tissue out and depleting it over time, or both if we've got vata and pitta running the show or going out of balance. Okay, so good estrogen versus bad. I think it's worth mentioning here that after your estradiol is produced in the ovaries or the adrenal glands, the body converts it into either good estrogen, which decreases our risk of cancer, or bad estrogen, which increases our risk of cancer. So either 2-hydroxyestrone or 16-alpha hydroxyestrone. That I think that's supposed to say 16 alpha, not 16 alpha. Sorry about the typo. There's no real explanation in Western medicine about why one is created over the other. Ayurveda would say, well, your digestive system, your liver that processes all this, and your energy body, your prana, they're unbalanced. And so they're creating something unsupportive versus something supportive. And there's no guarantee that your body's going to produce good estrogen over bad estrogen when you introduce it as a supplement, right? So it's something to consider. If you're going to supplement with hormones, with hormone replacement therapy, make sure your digestive system and everything is in really good working order. And so I've worked with women who are on hormone replacement therapy in Ayurveda and in an Ayurvedic setting, and we work on their digestion and we work on their nervous system. And we want to make sure that if they're taking in things from the outside, they're putting it to good use, right? So Ayurveda can support you even if you are choosing to go a more allopathic route. I like to point that out. Okay, so sex hormones and progesterone. Let's talk about progesterone. Progesterone is like what keeps the estrogen in check. Okay, it prepares the uterus for the fertilized egg. It maintains pregnancy, and it maintains the uterine lining until the egg, if the egg isn't fertilized, then we menstruate, right? So that drop in progesterone triggers monthly menstruation. It keeps our estrogen in balance post-menopause, and it can help us balance weight. It can stimulate and maintain bone growth. So progesterone is like kapha, but with some pitta. right? It's sustaining, but it's gonna keep things in check and regulate, maybe, burn things up if it's not needed. So too much estrogen can cause swelling and weight gain and potentially breast cancer. Progesterone is a natural diuretic. It gets rid of the swelling and it actually helps prevent certain types of reproductive cancer. So progesterone is your balancing force for estrogen. Okay. And here's why. Because progesterone is produced in the ovaries until menopause and then in the adrenal glands after menopause. And your body can produce estrogen from progesterone. Yay. Okay. So progesterone is a really important source of estrogen post-menopause. It doesn't go the other way though. Okay. So estrogen follows progesterone's lead. Okay. If there isn't enough, the body can create estrogen from progesterone. And if there's too much estrogen, your progesterone can come in and balance it. Okay. So here's the catch though. Your body can also produce cortisol from progesterone. And we're going to talk about this in a moment. Talk about stress hormones. So if you're stressed out all the time and you're producing a lot of cortisol, you're going to sacrifice your progesterone, your potential estrogen postmenopause or premenopause even for cortisol. Okay. So the body always prioritizes saving itself from perceived danger, whether it's physical or emotional, over its reproductive faculties or functions, right? Even over digestion, over sleep. It's like, where's the lion, tiger, or bear? I'm going to keep you at the ready for it and keep pumping this stress hormone out. Um, and we're going to do that over digesting your food or making you sleepy at the right time or producing sex hormones or even, in your fertile time of life, making you fertile, right? If this body isn't safe, another body growing inside of it isn't going to be safe either. So we're not going to prioritize that. Okay. So progesterone. What does it look like when it's in deficiency or excess? Low progesterone, it's a little tricky here. Low progesterone could look like estrogen deficiency. So low progesterone could look like low estrogen, hot flashes, vaginal dryness, bone loss, right? Because we don't have enough progesterone to produce the estrogen we need postmenopause. Okay. Maybe you don't have a lot of fat cells going on. Maybe a lot of women get to this life and they get even more competitive, right? They want to prove their worth and show that, we can do anything and we can. And for a lot of times that looks like strenuous exercise or competitive exercise. So we don't have a lot of fat. And so if we're pumping out a lot of cortisol too, then we don't have enough progesterone to produce the estrogen we need. Okay. So low progesterone could also look like estrogen dominance. So you've got a lot of estrogen, like I said, maybe you've got a lot of fat tissue, okay, but you don't have enough progesterone to keep it in check. So then we get weight gain, we get swelling, we get fibroids. Too much progesterone is usually not a common complaint. Okay, it's usually we just don't have enough of it, and so it's going to look like either we have too much estrogen because that estrogen is not in abundance to keep it in check, or we don't have enough estrogen because you're post-menopause, you don't have enough fat, or you've got too much cortisol pumping through your system, and your progesterone is going toward stress hormones instead of trying to produce estrogen. Okay, so don't be afraid to come back to this slide and rewind the video and listen to that again if you're watching the recording, because this is an important concept, especially if you're trying to figure out, do I need hormone replacement? Do I not? What do I need to work on, right? So with hormone replacement therapy, okay, what are the sources? It's important to know. One of them is conjugated equine estrogen. Okay, the most common brand is Premarin. It was like the first one, pregnant mare urine. Okay, that's where the name comes from. And it can also be synthesized from chemicals in labs. So estrogen, progesterone, and testosterone can be synthesized from chemicals in labs, or from plants. Okay, usually yams or soy, and these are our bioidentical hormones. Okay, they take the most potent constituent of the plant and they extract it and then they synthesize it and make it more potent. Okay, so that's our bioidentical hormones. So here's some considerations around hormone replacement therapy. There's no guarantee, like I mentioned before, that your body's going to take the replacements and produce the good estrogen or the bad estrogen. So if you're taking HRT, want to make sure your diet and your digestive system are tip-top shape. Okay, and that might even resolve some of your hormonal imbalance. Honestly, interestingly enough. So Every estrogen, even the bioidentical ones on the market come with a warning label because of this giant study that was done. It's called the Women's Health Initiative. It began in 1991. It ended in 2002. It involved almost 20,000 women. And they had to stop the study because women were getting cancer and heart disease and embolisms, heart attacks, strokes, dementia. So they were seeing women who were in the study um, come up with these symptoms and diseases. Estrogen alone therapy, this is the warning label you'll see on even bioidentical hormones because of this study. Estrogen alone therapy increases your risks of endometrial cancer, strokes, deep vein thrombosis, dementia and Alzheimer's, and estrogen with progesterone therapy increases your risks of strokes, deep vein thrombosis, pulmonary embolism, heart attacks, invasive breast cancer, and dementia. Yikes. Okay. And even bioidentical hormones have these warnings on the label. A lot of doctors will say, you know what, the Women's Health Initiative study has been discredited, and all these other studies have come out, and we do this in such a different way, and things are safer. But apparently, not not enough that they haven't taken this warning label off of the drugs. And I just bring this up because, I think we're so desensitized, right? We see the advertisements for drugs on TV, and then all of the side effects, and we just kind of dismiss it because they're so prevalent, right? Or we don't open up the pamphlet, that comes with our prescription drugs and read it because it's probably depressing and maybe we don't want to know about it. But I think it's important to just know what the risks are. Okay. There are problems with with the Women's Health Initiative study. Many women in the study were quote quote older. They were over 60, and it's generally not recommended to give women hormone replacement therapy over 60 these days, or for too long, right? More than 5 or 10 years past menopause, and they were administered these hormones for a long time. Only one kind of estrogen was used. It was that equine derived Premarin, and only one type of progesterone was used. And I don't even think that progesterone is used anymore, or that progestin is used anymore, because it does actually carry a higher cancer risk, right? So they're saying, well, the study isn't relevant because we don't really prescribe these that often anymore. And some experts say, using the more modern transdermal estrogen, the patch, right, instead of oral estrogen or a pill, actually lowers the risk of something like blood clots, one of those risk symptoms, because it bypasses the liver, it bypasses the digestive system. Ayurveda would say, wow, we're bypassing a really intelligent system that tends to shunt things where it needs to go, right? The liver, it does a really good job of converting things into the type of estrogen we need. So I think there could be problems with bypassing the digestive system. Some experts are saying, well, that's actually going to lower some risks like blood clots. Bioidentical hormone health replacement considerations. So, hormone replacement considerations. Bioidentical hormones are considered safer in general, but the jury's still out. They haven't been around, honestly, for that long. And one of the things that Ayurveda would say, or that I just would say, we're removing the active constituent from the rest of the plant. And so we're removing this, like, potentially millions of years of evolutionary intelligence, right? Ayurveda only uses whole herbs and whole plants. We're not taking out the curcumin from turmeric, right? In fact, it's really hard to overdose on turmeric. You might get some digestive issues, you might turn yellow, but if you take curcumin, the active constituent of turmeric, the curcumin extract, you actually can produce inflammation when you take too much of it, right? So there is a toxic load to some of these extracts, and they're largely unstudied. That is changing because they're largely unstudied because you can't patent something in nature, right? You can't patent a plant, but there are some companies that are starting to come up with sort of these cocktails, right, so to speak, or recipes around how they're combining and synthesizing in the lab some of these extracts or these potent constituents of the plants. And so they are starting to study some of the toxicity levels. I think that's coming. Let's see. And then also bioidentical estrogen. This is something that came from the Women's Health Initiative study. It was a follow-up study in 2009 and included 17,000 women. It's a big study. They experienced new onset breast tenderness as a result of taking estrogen and progesterone, if they experienced that, they were 50% more likely to be diagnosed with breast cancer over the next 5 to 6 years. So if they were experiencing new onset breast tenderness because they were taking the synthetic estrogen progesterone combo, they were 50% more likely to be diagnosed with breast cancer over the next 5 or 6 years. I find that's pretty compelling. So, bioidentical estrogen does produce for a lot of women new onset breast tenderness. So, is it risky in that way? Again, the jury, I think, is still out. Ayurveda and holistic considerations for hormone replacement therapy in general. We're trying to trick the body when we're introducing synthetic or bioidentical hormones. We're introducing outside sources of what our body's supposed to be producing naturally. So one of the arguments is that, right, it just gives us permission to carry on with our unsupportive habits. Where it just gives us permission to keep on doing what we're doing, which is what got us here in the first place, right? So it's not actually solving a problem. When we have a lack or an excess of a hormone, our body's trying to tell us something. We need to tune in and solve it with behavioral modifications, dietary shifts, and those are hard and they can take a long time. So even if you used hormone replacement therapy as sort of a stopgap measure, while you're trying to get your lifestyle and your diet in order, I think that can be better than just more supportive, let's say. I don't want to say better. I don't want to sound judgmental, but it can be more supportive in the long run and less risky than just relying on the estrogen and progesterone to protect you, right? Protect your bones and your heart and your brain, instead of doing the things that we all have within our power, our purview, and our autonomy to do. But getting there can be really hard, right? Because we've got a lifetime of habits or alternative are opposite, right? Opposite habits or lifestyle practices that we might be dealing with. And also the body, the liver now has to deal with more hormones that it didn't actually create, right? So we're adding more for the digestive system to deal with. So these are just considerations I think, we want to take into account. Stress hormones. Okay, what are stress hormones? Hormones. They're pitta and they're vata, right? They're vata fanning the flames of pitta. They're the two major ones are adrenaline and cortisol. They're survival hormones. They trigger our fight or flight reaction, right? So that sympathetic nervous system response to real or perceived threats to our well-being. Okay, so the body doesn't differentiate between the lions, tigers, and bears and the really hard conversation you had with your partner tonight, or the argument you got in, or the pressure you're getting at work from your boss. So it's going to produce these hormones, whether it's an emotional threat or a physical threat. Okay. And it's going to prioritize that over everything else. And we're also going to look at DHA. This is sort of like progesterone is to estrogen. DHA is to cortisol. It balances, it keeps it in check. Okay. So what are stress hormones? What do they do? How do they function? Adrenaline and cortisol are closely related. When adrenaline goes up, cortisol goes up. Adrenaline is what gives you that quick response so that you can run, you can flee, and it goes down really fast. Cortisol sticks around, and the longer it stays up, the longer it takes us to recover from an adrenaline surge. The more adrenaline surges we have, the more cortisol gets released with every surge. Okay, so it's sort of this positive feedback loop. Cortisol is produced in the outer portion of our adrenal glands. It controls our metabolism of carbs, fats, and protein. It has benefits. It's a really plays an important role in infection fighting, blood sugar balance, immune system response, thinking, other healthy functions. But when it's in excess, we get risk factors. So we get increased risk of depression, osteoporosis, weight loss or weight gain because of its effect on the thyroid, cardiovascular problems, high blood pressure, and then a host of other women's health issues. Okay. And this begins even before menopause or perimenopause even. Cortisol is the enemy of ojas. Okay. It is the enemy of your ability to withstand stress and your resiliency and your juiciness, right? It's the enemy of estrogen. So cortisol and adrenaline are absolutely necessary. They help save our lives, avoid danger, But the problem in contemporary society is that we all have emotional stress and overwhelm due to all of these hats we wear, right, as women, or that we're required to wear, that we put on ourselves even. And the body, again, responds the same way to emotional stress and confrontation with your boss as it does to physical threats. Okay. So long term, the problem with being in this near constant state of stress is that we've got cortisol coursing through our system at all times. And at some point, we run out of the supply of it. We can't produce it anymore to meet the demand, right? Because remember, with every adrenaline surge, we start producing more cortisol each time. And so we run out of the building blocks. So our body, because it prioritizes survival, will find any way to produce more cortisol, any way to do it. And so, one way to do it is to sacrifice our sex hormones. Remember, we can use our progesterone to produce more cortisol. And then we've either got too much estrogen because there's no progesterone to keep it in check, or we don't have enough estrogen because we don't have the progesterone to produce it. Okay. Our adrenal glands are busy producing cortisol out of that progesterone. Um, and I just put this in here because it's interesting. If if you're in your fertile time of life, and you are thinking about getting pregnant or know someone who is, care about someone who is, pregnant moms, they can use their unborn child's adrenal glands to produce more cortisol when they're in a stressed out state. And so both of them end up with these enlarged adrenal glands, especially in the newborn, and an increased sensitivity to stress for both of them. So just public service announcement. If you know anyone who's trying to get pregnant or you are, it's really important to manage your stress, right? Really, really important. So the more cortisol we have in our systems, the more sensitive we become to stress. Okay, so then we have more of these stressful moments, and then we produce more cortisol when we have them, right? And so it's at the expense of all of these tissues and hormones that keep us resilient, our ojas. So long-term elevated cortisol results in thyroid resistance. The cortisol suppresses our thyroid stimulating hormone. And so then the thyroid produces less T3 and T4. We go into a hypothyroid state. The cortisol can also inhibit T4, the inactive thyroid hormone, conversion to T3, the active thyroid hormone, in our liver. Really interesting, right? Here's the liver again, so important. And this can cause thyroid hormone deficiency, even though the thyroid's producing enough. And so then the hypothalamus goes, pituitary gland, let's produce more TSH. Let's produce more thyroid stimulating hormone because I don't think the thyroid's doing its job, even though it is. So then it starts producing more T3 and T4, but the liver's still not doing the conversion, right? And so the cycle keeps happening. The brain's not getting the message that thyroid's doing its job. It's just the liver can't do it because the cortisol is suppressing it. And so the thyroid organ will just keep going and going and going and eventually fail. So it's like hyperthyroid going into hypothyroid. Also, the cortisol's effect on your nervous system can cause a combination of hyperthyroid and hypothyroid issues, right? And that will usually end up looking like autoimmune issues, right? Like Hashimoto's thyroiditis. Um, Cortisol also hinders our optimal function of sex hormones, as we've seen, but because, again, the body prioritizes survival over procreation, it promotes the breakdown of all of our tissues, our bones, our skin, our muscles, our cardiovascular, and our brain nervous system for metabolism into glucose by the liver. So the body wants this real immediate source of fuel so that you can run from or fight the lion, tiger, or bear. And so it sacrifices our tissue to produce glucose. And then it blocks your progesterone's ability to support bone and tissue growth because it's trying to use them for fuel. And so it blocks sex hormones. Really interesting, isn't it? Over time, it will promote weight gain, especially around the midsection, which then is more associated with type 2 diabetes and heart disease, because your cortisol hinders insulin, right? And we need insulin to uptake glucose from the blood. But when the body's in fight or flight mode, we want all that sugar shunted to our joints and our muscles so that we can run or fight and outrun that threat. We don't want the pancreas producing insulin to bring our blood sugar down. So eventually, that cortisol will break down our muscle and then slow down our metabolism too. So it stops us from uptaking glucose. It stops the pancreas from producing insulin. And then it also breaks down muscle. So our metabolism starts to go down over time. And then low libido is another side effect, right? Why would we be procreating when we've got a real threat to deal with? It accelerates aging, so we get into early menopause. Even when we have a normal amount of estrogen and progesterone, the body's going to relegate those sources to the extremities and keep them on standby so they can be used to flee or fight the danger. So it slows us down as far as our digestion, our vital organs, but also it keeps us from sleeping. So we're like tired and depleted, but we're wired and ready to go. And that compromises the immune system. So short-term cortisol production, short-term stress, like when you do a little fasting seasonally. I'll send you some information about fasting and seasonal fasts that Ayurveda supports. Um, so when we're sick and in nature, we tend to not have much of an appetite. And you'll see like your dog or your cat, right? When they don't feel well, they don't eat. When we fast, it's the body's natural way of producing enough cortisol to fight off an infection. It will boost our immune system. But if we've got cortisol going on all the time, it actually weakens our immune system, right? And so we're more susceptible to, like, we're getting colds and flu all the time. We're not as responsive to vaccines. So it can lower the immune system in that way. And then that can contribute to cancer development, recurring infections, especially the respiratory tract, so our lungs. And then we've got this hormone called DHA. It's a precursor, primarily made in the adrenal glands, like cortisol. And it's got this balancing effect on cortisol the way progesterone does on estrogen. So, DHA, what does it do? How does it work? It acts as a weak estrogen. It can be used to make estrogen or testosterone. It helps reduce bad cholesterol, LDL cholesterol. It increases our muscle mass and our energy and helps build and repair our proteins, our tissues. So, how do we produce more of this DHA naturally? Well, you can supplement with it for sure, but how do we produce it more naturally? We do moderate cardio, that lowers our cortisol. We get adequate vitamin D that supports our adrenal glands and DHEA synthesis. We get a diet rich in omega 3s, really healthy fats, right? And good minerals, magnesium, protein, and fiber. These are all the building blocks of DHEA. We get good sleep. So it's all the things we know, right? All the things that would just balance our hormones in general, or our doshas in general. And we reduce stress so that your adrenals stop sacrificing the DHEA, and the progesterone for stress hormones, for cortisol. Okay. There are some natural balancers to these stress hormones that are, I guess, technically sex hormones, but they're not major sex hormones. They're oxytocin and prolactin. Oxytocin is the cuddle hormone, the relaxation hormone. It also is essential in initiating labor and lactation after labor. So men under stress, they tend to isolate and problem solve, kind of go into a man cave and analyze things. And women, a lot of just because of this energy we have in evolution, we find comfort in tending to the needs of others, which can get problematic, but also befriending women in our community, right? We tend to try to form these social bonds and networks, which a lot of us, I feel like, have gotten away from in our society. And so, the more we do this, form these really beautiful bonds and community, the more oxytocin we produce, and the more stress hormones and stress in general decreases. So low levels of oxytocin are actually associated with depression. And so the more connection we have, typically the more content we are, the healthy we are, right? So you can imagine all that time we spend online. We can connect for sure. It's like we're doing through the ether right now, but there's no substitute, right, for a close bond with someone you really care about, and a friend group, right, a support group. So prolactin is another one. It's also responsible for lactation, but it's still present and it's regulated by your estrogen in menopause. So it helps reduce our fear and our anxiety and the effects of stress. It's produced by the pituitary gland up in the brain. And dopamine, interestingly, inhibits it. So things that give you a big hit of dopamine, like alcohol, caffeine, drugs, this like temporary high, it will inhibit our prolactin production. So we want to be careful with our stimulants, right? Be careful with our stimulants. And nipple stimulation also helps stimulate prolactin as well. So foreplay, it matters. Okay. So, how to stop cortisol in its tracks? So, we talked about some of these things, and so there's some resources here for you. So, moderate, regular exercise. This effectively stops the stress cycle. Okay, really important. And I think this is a great book to read. It's all about burnout. It's written by women for women. Burnout, the secret to unlocking the stress cycle. They talk all about the things that help stop the stress cycle. Exercise is a big one, but also breath work, pranayama, especially alternate nostril breathing. I'm going to send you guys a recording for alternate nostril breathing. Um, we actually burn fat through our exhales, right? So I think something like 80 or more percent of our fat that we burn is actually excreted through our CO2, through carbon dioxide as we exhale. It makes sense because our breath rate increases when we exercise. That's where we're burning fat. Um, and so if we're doing breath work, according to Ayurveda, we store grief in our fat cells. And it starts in the lungs. And if we don't deal with it, it settles into our fat cells. It overflows, they say, and settles into our fat cells. And we gain weight. A lot of us have gained weight after a sad time in our life, right? Or during a sad time. And so we can burn fat and Ayurveda says deal with stored grief and sadness and stored emotions through breath work, through pranayama. And the alternate nostril breathing that I'll send you guys a recording of, if you want to practice it, helps balance the two hemispheres of the brain and then the two nervous system responses, or the sympathetic and the parasympathetic nervous system responses, right? So it kind of like balances the stress and the homeostasis, the stress hormones, sex hormones. It taxes our nervous system just enough to make it stronger, but it also taps into and gives us, because the diaphragm and the way we're expanding it and massaging the vagus nerve, it gives us a relaxation response as well. So breath work's really important. Your yoga nidra, I'm sending you guys some yoga nidra resources after class 2, along with the recording. 20 minutes of yoga nidra equals 1 hour of sleep. And there are a lot of recent studies. It's been called, of course, it's a thousands of year old practice, right? But now modern science is studying it, and they're calling it non-sleep deep rest. NSDR, or non-sleep deep relaxation. So you can Google or search on YouTube for free recordings, but I'll send you guys links to them from a practitioner I really love. Her name is Ali Boothroyd. Yoga Nidra is something that has helped me so much with my cortisol, my stress, and my work-life balance. If you can start a yoga nidra practice, it will sustain you for life, especially if you have insomnia or trouble sleeping, or vata imbalance or pitta imbalance, or hormonal imbalance, right? Meditation increases our melatonin production. It boosts our immune system and it reduces our anxiety and stress. They have studied blood and saliva in people who meditate and have proven that these things are occurring. Hugs seems simple, but really, especially really long hugs, they shift the nervous system out of fight or flight, and they lower our cortisol levels. They can also stop the stress cycle, just like exercise can, breath work can. And then community. Loneliness has been shown to create more cortisol and lowered immune system in people who say they are lonely. So community is so powerful. Can't stress that enough. So important at this time of life. And then spiritual devotion of any kind, whatever that means for you, whether it's, quantum physics, or love, unconditional love, or God, or, an organized religion. It's whatever floats your boat. It doesn't have to look any certain way. But when we feel spiritual energy, or this connectedness, this oneness, this unity with the universe or each other, it releases a cascade of healing hormones associated with the relaxation response, and it reduces or turns off our cortisol production. Pretty empowering. So feel your feelings. That's another thing, right? Give yourself time to experience your emotions, like grief, especially. Okay, so it doesn't end up getting stored away and turning into disease later. Deal with it now. So aging gracefully is an interesting concept, and I just wanted to kind of show you what's happening over the lifetime. At puberty, or the onset of that pitta time of life, that productive, fiery time of life, our sex hormones increase wildly, right? It's just why teenage years can be so miserable for some of us. At 35, this is when people are saying really perimenopause starts. At 35, your progesterone naturally begins to decline. And this progesterone is what sustains a pregnancy. In our contemporary world, this is usually when we're trying to conceive, right? Because we want to establish our career. And so there's this sort of epidemic around fertility and conception. And it's no coincidence that this is when your sex hormones start to drop, right? It's interesting to think about. Not, you can get pregnant at this age. You can get pregnant, into your 50s if you're menstruating and ovulating into your 50s, but which some women are. But it gets harder, right? So it's just something to consider. If we're staying in balance, though, it probably won't be too hard. Around 50, our sex hormones decrease significantly, right? This is in menopause. So post-menopause, women are producing 40 to 60% fewer sex hormones than they were before, right? It's a big drop. It's about half, maybe a little more than that. And by the time we're 80, a few decades later, we're only producing 10 to 25% of our DHEA, that sex hormone precursor, that estrogen precursor and stress reliever, than we did when we were 20. Okay, so big drop. But this is part of a perfect design, right? Because by the time we're 50, we don't need to push our way through obstacles, theoretically. We don't need to have and raise babies anymore and compete for resources, right? We'd be wiser by the time we get to this age, calmer, more easeful because of the lessons we've learned. But I think we tend to fight, right? This natural transition. And so this isn't always the case. And then the problems ensue. Aging isn't the problem. It's the accumulation of stress over our lives, right? We've been sacrificing our sex hormones even before menopause. And so it's going to keep happening in menopause, after menopause, right? How we deal with our stress is the problem. The stress isn't going to go away. The things that cause the stress, right, aren't going to go away. How we deal with them is what can change, though, right? And those are the symptoms related to our life transition. So what do? We start by listening to our body. We don't ignore the signs. And even if your hormone test results come back or whatever your blood work comes back with nothing abnormal, it doesn't mean your symptoms aren't real, right? So these are precursor signs that, when unheeded, can lead to real disease. And Ayurveda says, okay, each one of these symptoms is representing one of the doshas, right? So we want to listen to them, find the root cause. And so all these things we've talked about, right? Brain fog, confused thinking. This can be sort of kapha, but also maybe vata. Little aches and pains. Any pain is vata. Stress, irritability, depression, vata. Poor short-term memory than normal. Vata. Heavier, lighter periods, kapha or vata. Hot flashes. We talked about that. Vata pushing pitta. Insomnia, headaches. Vata usually because of the pain and the upregulation of the nervous system. Depends though, could be some pitta going on there if there's problem solving or sensitivity to light. And then our digestive complaints, lack of appetite, mostly kapha. So Ayurveda says, hey, we can deal with all this stuff. We have solutions and we've been working with this stuff for thousands of years. So we identify the qualities of your symptoms and then we apply opposite qualities.